Welcome everyone to the Center for Heritage first webinar. I'm just going to wait for a few minutes because I can see the number of participants increasing so that everyone can listen what I'm going to say. So welcome all to the Center for Heritage's first webinar on the academic year on heritage crime and archaeology. I am delighted to have three excellent speakers and experts in their field who will present on reversal chronological order how forensic science can be used to identify crime when the object is taken out of its context, where it comes from, when it's unearthed or detached from a monument, and if it is possible to find clues as its place of origin, as to its function also. And we are going to follow the clues or the thread in order to understand why forensics is important, even if the object is found in the art market. So the next presentation, sorry. So we have this from Professor Gill, then we'll have Carl Harrison, who will present the study of forensic science and examine the practice of crime scene examination and how they could be adapted to solve heritage crime. And we will conclude with a presentation by Mark Harrison, who will look at the progress made to improve and strengthen the investigation and enforcement of heritage crime in England. So before we start, I just want to highlight to our attendees who are coming and listening from different places in the world that you will have the option to ask questions to the panelists using the chat function. So the format of the webinar does not allow people to ask direct questions or to unmute themselves. So we are sorry about that, but there are many attendees and it was not possible for this. So please ask your questions using the chat. They can be seen by all speakers and we will address those questions at the end of the presentations. So our first speaker is Professor David Gill, who is a former Rome scholar at the British School at Rome, who has taught and comes from several prestigious universities. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, the FRSAR, and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He's also, and I'm very pleased about that, an honorary fellow at the Kent Law School and a member of the Center for Heritage. David, the floor is yours.
Sophie, thank you very much indeed for the very warm welcome, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to just share my screen, and here we go. There we go. Okay. Well, my paper is going to be a case study, and it's going to be looking at a series of Roman bronzes that are in two collections in North America. The question in my mind is this: what are the clues that suggest a potential heritage crime should be investigated? There can be little snippets of information that accompany an object that surfaces on the market. The names of previous collectors and dealers can alert us to potential issues, and scientific study can hint at anomalies. The case presented here is reported to have been investigated by a special committee in Cleveland back in 2008 after a request for a return of objects by the Italian authorities. But as far as I know, this board has never reported, and a request to the Cleveland Museum of Art for further information earlier this year has been left unanswered, although it was acknowledged. In the early 1980s, 4 Roman bronzes surfaced on the London antiquities market. They include, on the left screen, the one with the helmet, is a figure of Virtus or Roma, and on the other side, a Ceres or Juno. They were purchased by the J. Paul Getty Museum. And you've seen the image of the Victoria with a cornucopia, the long horn. That was acquired by the Cleveland Museum of Art in the same year. And then in the center of this screen, 2 Towgate magistrates, they're part of a single casting, was sold to a North American private collector and then sold to the Getty the following year. The 3 pieces now in the Getty, these 3, were declared at their point of acquisition to have been purchased on the European art market. But the Getty's online catalogue now confirms that this anonymous source was the London-based dealer Robin Symes. The 2 Towgate magistrates were sold to Morris Templesman, where the bronze was catalogued in 1984 and then sold along with a number of other items to the Getty. Not one of the 4 bronzes has a history that precedes Symes, suggesting that there's nothing further to disclose about the sequence of ownership. Is it possible to extract any further information about the pieces? All 4 bronzes were exhibited in the Cleveland Museum of Art touring exhibition, The God's Delight. In each of the 4 catalogue entries, it was noted that the bronze in question, and here's the quote, traveled through the art market and conceivably found with, and then it gives the numbers for the other 3. Well, how should we interpret this information? One possible solution has been suggested. Perhaps scholarship will never know if these pieces were found together or merely shared the same packing case as they crossed an international frontier. So to the bit on the scientific study. Scientific study may suggest some further connections and clarification. The patination on the Ceres or Juno, that's the figure on the right with the little modern bracket on the back, shows an overall light green patina turning greenish brown near the feet. Much of the surface is covered with a heavy incrustation. And then the other figure with the helmet, an overall light greenish brown patina covers the piece, and there is only some minor incrustation on the back. Does the minor incrustation on the back of the figure suggest it had been protected by a feature from which the figure had been prized away during its perhaps illicit removal? The study of the corrosion products on the rear of the Juno suggests that the burial environment allowed sufficient space for localized corrosion to develop and for the copper carbonates to be retained on the surface. An analysis of the surface materials by David Scott and others of all 4 pieces seems to suggest they did indeed come from the same burial. And I'll quote Scott here. One of the other very significant remnant of associated material links these 4 bronzes. Small fragments of red brick or tile are preserved on the back surfaces of the Roma, Venus, and Togati, that's the magistrates, and the Cleveland Nike, the Victoria, had such fragments too before they were mechanically cleaned. The composition of the brick samples was considered to be, quotes, relatively homogeneous. Had the brick or tile come from an adjacent structure, such as a portico? The patina itself on the bronzes all seems very close. And in particular, and on this slide, these fibrous malachite crystals are found not only on the 3 figures in the Getty, but also on the Cleveland Victoria. Again, Scott has commented on this. Finding 2 objects within a relatively small museum collection with such surface features is uncommon and suggests the close association of the objects. A hypothesis strengthened by the belief that they may have traveled through the art market from the same source. The burial environment of both must have been very similar for the whisker-like crystals to grow from the surface of both bronzes. The corrosion products must have had space to grow unimpeded in the site environment which is unusual. In other words, the scientific study suggests that it's possible to go beyond the theory that the bronzes formed a common consignment, but that it is possible they actually shared the same archaeological context. Was there some sort of void in the deposit that would have allowed such crystals to grow? The likely context is explained by Scott. The environmental conditions were favourable to the permeation of groundwaters and to oxygenated soil conditions, and also allowed enough space adjacent to some of the object surfaces for the fibrous malachite crystals to grow. Could such a protective context have been provided by a pyroclastic ash flow? When Juno or Roma were acquired by the Getty, it was thought that they'd not only come from the same workshop, but also may have been part of the same monument. It was originally observed for the Juno that the modelling of the drapery is so similar to the magistrates that it seems likely that they were both produced in the same workshop. Both the Juno and the Roma have the same hexagonal network structure in the patina that you can see on this slide. Well, if these four bronzes were found together, what could connect them? The Virtus and the Victoria were listed explicitly in the God's Delight catalogue as possible chariot attachments. In the case of the magistrate shown here, they were thought to have been an applique for a historical relief or ceremonial vehicle, and that they must have been affixed to some object, such as a piece of furniture or a chariot. You can see the hollow back to them. The Victoria was mounted slightly differently, apparently through the missing left foot, and could have stood on the railing of the chariot. Well, the suggestion is that these bronzes were derived from a chariot monument similar to the monumental one discovered at Herculaneum that was decorated with similar relief figures. Here are three of the figures on this slide. These figures were about 65 centimeters high and appear to have been mounted on the chariot body. So they're about twice the size of those in the Getty and Cleveland. The scheme for such a frieze layout can be seen on the side panels of the Victory Chariot of Marcus Aurelius, on a relief originally displayed on a now lost triumphal arch in Rome. And you can see Marcus Aurelius with just the bottom of a Victoria, a victory over his head. And you can see the panel of the chariot with those figures there. So I think it would have looked something like this. If the four bronzes were indeed derived from the same context and were attached to the same monumental group, where would such a monument have been located? Would this have been a bronze group, such as a four-horse chariot with a charioteer being crowned by Victoria, placed on a stone base and displayed in a public space? Would it be likely that the bronzes would have remained together in a relatively secure deposit if the putative chariot group had been toppled after, say, an earthquake? Could the bronzes have been removed from a context in the region of the Bay of Naples? Would this type of context have provided the conditions for the distinctive corrosive products on the bronzes? The four bronzes all feature in the Scanusa archive linked to Robin Symes. This association would urge caution, as this dealer has been associated with material that has been returned to Italy and indeed to Greece. The scientific analysis, as well as the reported detail from the vendor, in other words, Symes, suggests that the bronzes may well have been derived from an illicit dig, perhaps around the Bay of Naples in the early 1980s. Such speculation on the original archaeological context for the four Roman bronzes can never be a replacement for the scientific excavation, recording, and interpretation of such finds. These decontextualized figures are a clear reminder why context matters. The scientific study of the bronzes raises questions that may not be answerable. But if these bronzes do indeed come from a rare but dismembered monument that was once displayed on a bronze chariot, should they now be returned to and reunited in Italy, where they can be placed on public display? Thank you. Sophie's on mute.
Apologies. You would think I would know. Thank you. I was just so taken by your presentation that I forgot to unmute myself. So this is really fascinating to see how forensic sciences can be used on objects that have been unearthed for so long. And now we're going to turn our attention to objects that might be still found in the ground, and how a crime scene investigation and how forensics is taking place in the, what I would call the real world. Being an academic, I obviously don't go out there very often, but Dr. Harrison is going to explain this to us. Carl is one of the director of Alectoforensics and is the lead for forensic ecologist. He's also one of the UK's leading practitioner researchers in forensic archaeology and has been involved in this discipline since 2001. So he has a very strong background in operational crime, crime scene coordination, and he's going to explain to us how this takes place in practice. Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. He's old. I think that's what you're trying to say. Let me just share my presentation. That was a fantastic presentation from David, and I was trying to look for hooks into what I wanted to say in over the next 10 minutes in relation to forensic archaeology. I see that there's a potential wealth of integrations between what we've established in forensic archaeology in the UK, in Europe, and in North America over the past 30 years in assisting with the development of approaches to heritage crime. But there are some challenges as well that come with that, some of which are long-standing institutionalized challenges, some of which we're still getting to grips with within what I would call standard forensic archaeology. So I'd like to look very briefly at what we do currently, what you get written on the tin for forensic archaeology, how that might translate across to looking at specifically at scenes associated with heritage crime, primarily excavation sites, but also linked scenes that we might be able to draw associations using ecological trace evidence. So soils and dormant pollen profiles predominantly, a little bit of diatoms work potentially as well, and addressing some of the challenges of integration between operational and academic practitioners. So that's been a long-standing challenge within standard forensic archaeology, and one that perhaps we can look at briefly in this context as well. Very briefly, so Sophie's already fantastically introduced me. The company's been running for the last 7 years. We provide a range of forensic ecology capability mainly for English and Welsh police forces, primarily within the UK, a little bit of international work. That is not thousands of jobs a year. It's something like 120 to 150 jobs a year that are a mixture of either crime scene attendances or laboratory analyses. The majority of the front end of that work will either be archaeological in nature, working directly for police forces. So where there's a requirement to assist with a search, that might be associated with a buried clandestine deposition, normally a body, but not necessarily so. It might front end with some anthropology work, so physical forensic anthropology, looking at unidentified hard tissue, so primarily skeletonized remains. Or it might start with some trace work, or it might lead into that. So soils, diatoms, single-celled aquatic algae, botanical pollen work, science-based dating, or entomology. In terms of me, most of my time now is spent trying to turn that mixed bag of random forensic stuff that kind of sits on the cusp of core forensic provision for most police forces, and turn that into a coherent forensic strategy, generally associated with major crime. I'm an archaeologist, but my background is as a crime scene manager, so working directly salaried by UK police forces. So having an understanding of how police forces think, particularly in the major crime context, is really useful in order to try and solve their problems. I have an academic role. I'm back in an academic role at Cranfield University, and I'm primarily scene focused. So I am by no stretch of the imagination what anybody would call a lab-based scientist. I'm rather more all-round, and the main thrust of what I do is to provide coordination and phasing and sequence strategy to optimize evidence collection for police forces. So starting with what we do now, so what does a forensic archaeologist do? Most importantly, most of the work is major crime focused. So that puts us out of what we call the realm of volume crime and dealing with a very specific set of police investigators. I've already said that's generally focused on the location, recovery, and interpretation of graves associated with criminal body depositions. It cuts across that entire sequence of work, going from desktop survey that you'd associate with more traditional archaeology, grave locations, excavations and recovery, recordings, interpretation, and communication to the courtroom around all of that activity. Ongoing awareness to police investigators and aftercare. So ensuring that follow-up analytical work associated with the recovery is utilizing forensic evidence to the best degree. Importantly, that context of operation, that major crime work, is conducted within a rather different environment. It's CID driven. It's working with generally with fairly large investigative teams with fairly large budgets, and something that's important to bear in mind across the board for any forensic work is that 95% of the UK's forensic capacity now, of England and Wales's forensic capacity now, is commercial in nature. So it's a difficult topic, but ensuring that the sorts of processes we put in place for heritage crime are both cost effective and timely is really important. Where do those links come? There's clearly a complementary skill set. In effect, myself and my colleagues and my peers are working and recording those features to standard archaeological standards. There's a huge overlap with the processes of more traditional archaeology. There's some overlap with authorities, so coronial jurisdiction bridges both death investigation to some extent, and also passing judgment on treasure within an English and Welsh context. There's a crucial need to be able to identify all sorts of material culture. So in teaching forensic archaeology, your eager and enthusiastic student body tends to be particularly focused on finding the forensic stuff, and within that, particularly on identification and recovery of bodies. But when you start digging holes in the ground, you're going to find all kinds of things. So forensic archaeologists can't exist in a vacuum. You have to be able to identify a fairly broad range of material culture to assist with any kind of excavation. And we have an existing analytical flow. So we have access to specialists and specialist reach back for different evidence types. So there's already processes in place that we can co-opt and utilize for heritage crime investigations across a breadth of different ecological evidence types. We can coordinate it, we can triage, and we can arrange for analysis to be undertaken, all of which has the potential to be appropriate for item-based, artifact-based examinations associated with heritage crime. What could we do? We certainly have the capability within forensic archaeology to provide a pretty much ready to go solution to a forensically appropriate excavation style. So whether that's associated with anti-contamination processes that would respect other evidence types, DNA proof protection. We can look at pattern matching and intelligence analysis across illegal excavation areas, so patterning of tool matches, site approach, soil sampling. We're quite used to looking at offender behavior associated with digging holes in the ground. And generally speaking, when we're looking at no-body murders, so searches, extensive searches associated with a murder investigation that has no body available to it at the outset, where the body has been deposited and hidden, we're used to examining ranges of vehicles and tools, footwear, and gloves, outdoor clothing associated with site exploitation. So where we don't have a site, but we do have suspect items that have come into police custody, then we can arrange strategies that look at sequential examination of those items. And similarly to artifact examination. So particularly with potentially buried items such as the bronzes that David's just shown, a range of different examination techniques with the caveat that there needs to be a very early conversation with conservation experts regarding strategies that are sympathetic to minimizing alteration and loss of context. For the most part, within major crime examinations, the items that we're examining, there aren't quite such concerns about examinations that would alter the material context of that item. And in this instance, we would need to look very closely at how we would adapt those techniques. I've kind of hinted at what I feel the main challenges are already, in that the work of the operational forensic archaeologist occurs within this bubble of the major incident environment that comes with a particular tasking cycle. So information comes into an incident room and it's turned into actions, and those actions are given to appropriate people to conduct. So I would expect to fall into that pattern, to be given some tasks and to be given a briefing, to have the support of a crime scene investigator to photographically record the work that I'm doing, and also of a crime scene manager that I can liaise with in order to ensure that the specialist insight that I'm going to give to a particular scene is contextualized within a more general forensic strategy. That CSI will also provide support around exhibit handling to ensure that any items that are recovered from a scene or sub-exhibited from an item being examined are entered back into the police system, the chain of continuity. The other challenge is managing expense, and in addressing a number of heritage-related investigations this year, we've worked really hard to look at ways in which we can take the accepted level of expenditure that you would associate with an extensive no-body murder and adapt that so that it's appropriate for operating within a heritage crime environment. So frequently within heritage investigations, we're working with much smaller investigative teams. The officers in charge of those investigations might be much more junior within their organizations. That might not relate to their level of investigative experience, but their authority and their purchasing power may well reflect in that role. So what we can provide as a solution to that needs to be appropriate to the level of investment that a police force is willing to engage with to ensure that that the file is completed. The other challenge that is long-standing within forensic archaeology that would be really interesting to explore further is, particularly as a practitioner base emerges from academics working within this area, is how do the caseworking practitioners and the research-based academics work optimally together? How do we communicate well and ensure that both aspects of what we do can work together in tandem? The practitioners need to be able to be flexible in their approach. So just because we have a long-standing approach to no-body murders, we're going to have to be flexible in how we make changes to that in dealing with heritage crime. The strategies that we put in place, the timescales that are appropriate in bringing an investigation to charge within policing, and adapted invoicing, so the level of charge associated with those activities. And by the same token, academics involved in this area, if not directly interested in the method of forensic archaeology, can certainly learn a lot from forensic service providers in terms of the minefield that can be laid in front of them with regards to operating in this area. So things like laboratory accreditation, which won't necessarily have a direct impact on a heritage crime investigation laboratory, but if there is a need at some stage to apply other more routine forensic techniques to an item that would require accreditation, then that's going to be important that the handling of that item is managed in a way that's sympathetic, so as not to create insuperable issues for other trace examination types. Insurance remains an issue. There are very few providers of insurance that are comfortable with providing cover for forensic excavations. The legal structures that control the exhibiting of items, the production of court-going statements, the disclosure of contemporaneous notes, and the interpretations of forensic reporters are all crucial to be understood by those beginning to venture into this world of practice. And there is long-standing experience, some of it painful, not all of it, within the world of forensic archaeology that can assist the developing discipline of heritage crime to be as clued up as possible in that area. And the other thing that you can't have enough of, I guess probably as a basis of my own background, is crime scene awareness. The more that you understand all sorts of aspects around approach to different types of crime scene, both physically in terms of the examination undertaken by crime scene investigators, and also in terms of investigation. So how an investigation is progressed by investigating police officers, the better academics will be at understanding the key challenges in a UK context around assisting thought leadership within the area of heritage crime investigation. And that's really a very niche view. I'm aware that I'm sort of talking about a very small, narrow silo within this area. There are all kinds of other broader aspects that I suspect forensic archaeology might have more to offer in terms of management and oversight over sites that are threatened, whether nationally or internationally. Environmental and second order threats. So how do threats to sites and items and material culture play out within the archaeological world, and what else can we do to try to disrupt or understand the trades that start from these sites? And internationally, how do we look at regional site vulnerability, and is there more that we can do empowering forensic archaeologists who perhaps already work for other governments internationally, or archaeologists employed within national museums or heritage ministries that it would be relatively easy to transfer their skills and ability into an interior ministry that would benefit greatly from the sorts of skills that they might already have within their governmental systems. And that's it, really. That's just a few thoughts from me in terms of how the major crime scene work and associated body of understanding within forensic archaeology might relate to some of the issues around heritage crime investigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl, for this very interesting presentation, and I think for the opening up the debate as well towards the end about capacity building and how what has been learned here can actually be shared as best practices with other countries and other communities. So thank you. We're now going to have a short presentation, a presentation by Mark Harrison, who is going to talk about crime here in the UK, because very often when we think about crime, we might think of crimes that are committed in other areas, in other countries, such as Italy, for example. Or we sometimes forget that crime and heritage crime also takes place here in the UK, in England, and that a lot is being done in order to address this type of crime. So Mark is, and also just quick remember that this presentation is recorded, so you will have the opportunity to watch everything again. And do not forget as well to ask questions in the chat if you want to. The questions will be addressed after Mark's talk. So Mark has worked for the Kent Police, and he's a keen archaeologist. He has worked as policing advisor at English Heritage for many years, and he's now the head of Heritage Crime and Strategy. He is also an honorary fellow of the Center for Heritage, and we have collaborated several times in organizing workshops and finding solutions, or at least not solutions because we can't just find solutions, but identifying priorities and also ways of addressing the heritage crime. Mark, the floor is yours.
I'm hoping this microphone works.
Yes, it's working.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I just looked through the delegate list, and I can see that some of us have been working together now for over 15 years on this topic. So congratulations for making it through. For me, this all started in 2005. I was the head of strategic partnerships for Kent Police, and with my background in archaeology, it gave me the opportunity to integrate the historic environment into our rural policing strategy. And to be honest with you, there were some raised eyebrows at the time, because we actually came up with a phrase that wasn't in regular use then, which was heritage crime. And no one could really pin down what it was about. So we tried to do that through analysis and looking at threats. And lo and behold, our friends at English Heritage commissioned something called the Nighthawking Survey, which was, I didn't know what it was. It was illicit metal detecting. So basically people using sophisticated devices to find objects buried in the ground. And they visited us in Kent and found out that we had quite a good structure to deal not just with nighthawking, but theft of metal from churches and people digging into scheduled monuments and other crimes. And it was actually put forward as best practice in this guide. And I got selected to become the policing advisor for English Heritage, as we were back then, and in Historic England now. But when I started the job, I was very candid with those people that had taken me on to say, I don't think this is just about metal detecting. I think it's about other things as well. And we did have, had some quizzical looks there. And I said, what we need to do is we need to come up with a bit of a plan, a strategy, so that we can actually understand what's going on, where it's going on, who's doing it, and what are we going to do about it. So I came up with these 4 pillars here: intelligence gathering, our ability to analyze that intelligence, understanding where the threats and the risks and the vulnerabilities were, and that's been raised earlier. And can we actually prevent that crime in the first place? And if we do have offences, can we investigate them? And what interventions are we going to use? Is it always going to be about prosecution? And can we shape legislation and policy? And can we do this by ourselves? Or have we got to develop a partnership? Have we got to involve the community? And more recently, and this wasn't at the time, more recently, how can we actually make people feel better about themselves and where they live? And the overall objective was to protect the historic and cultural environment. So that's what we did. And I set myself 5 bullets. Examine what was going on already, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. Explore if those things were working. Could we integrate them into work in England? and enhance them, develop it and integrate it into existing structures. And that was the key thing. Was this was at the time of austerity, and policing numbers were dropping, local authority numbers were dropping. We couldn't basically create new work. So here's 8 types of what we would now know as heritage crime: theft of metal from churches, theft of objects from the seabed. I know we've got divers on the call today. Theft of stone, arson, theft of our postal heritage, Bronze Age artifacts. The problem for us was in 2011 was high volume of incidents, low capability to respond. And I think we've now got ourselves in year 10 into relatively low volume of incidents and a high capability to respond. And I'll explain what that means in a second. The trick now is to maintain that capability. In terms of leadership, we have 2 chief officers, Amanda Blakeman and Charlie Doyle. They lead on heritage and cultural property crime and metal theft respectively. So we sit on both groups. 46 police services that we have to deal with. The Crown Prosecution Service, Paul Shrimpton is our heritage advocate, and he supervises the 15 heritage and wildlife coordinators. And of course, Historic England, we are the government statutory advisor on the historic environment, and we are supported in the 3 remaining home nations by Historic Environment Scotland, Cadets, and the Department of Environment in Northern Ireland. And our wider stakeholder network, ARCH, is now up to 200 organisations. Now, these organisations bring expertise, resources, which can sometimes mean people and money, but the big thing for us is powers. If we don't have a power to deal with something, there's always someone that has a power. There are 400,000 protected sites in England alone. The majority of these are owned by the public. It's open source. You can check to see where the protected sites are in your area. This is Lincoln. The red areas are buried protected archaeology. The blue triangles are protected buildings. And we have a definition, and it's pretty straightforward. It's any offence which harms the value of England's heritage assets. And harm in this context means beyond financial loss. The courts now understand the concept of the loss and damage of knowledge. When we started, all of our research had to be done academically. We really didn't have any idea of what the scale and extent of the problem was. We thought it was about 200 attacks a day. But we're now getting more smart and working to the national intelligence model. And you'll see here 7 priority areas for us that are driven by a national threat assessment. We're now coming into our 4th assessment period. And I can tell you that these won't really change. And unfortunately, architectural theft, in particular the theft of metal, will remain at number 1. And very recently, Historic England has been very pleased to announce funding for 2 analytical and research positions with Opal and Kent Police. And these officers will work to the 2 national working groups to actually help us identify the threats and where we should place our resources. In terms of community outreach, the Heritage Watch scheme goes from strength to strength. This is part of the Neighbourhood Watch pantheon, and you'll see that heritage is the sump, the oil sump on that tractor. I'd prefer if it was further up the tractor, but there you go. Operational now in 6 areas in the country and expanding all the time. And in Kent, we have 3 particular pilot areas at Swanscombe, Hollingbourne and Ramsgate, where the community are actually involved in understanding and assessing the threats and risks to the heritage in their area. And we feel this is really important because it's not doing something to them, it's taking them with us on that journey. And I'm very pleased to say that Heritage Watch now exists in Wales. And in terms of our ability and capability to respond, we now have a growing cohort of heritage crime officers. I think Andy Long's on the call today. So here we are, Kent, overlooking the protected wreck at Tankerton Beach. Andy Long, who's on the call today, who is our tactical lead for Operation Kronos, which is the national campaign to address illicit metal detecting. Tom Carter and his team, a very much expanded team down in Sussex. Devon and Cornwall, our newest area. Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire in the Peak District. So you can see we've moved from being quite exotic to being not quite part of day-to-day business, but I think we're getting there. This is Emily Thomas from Wiltshire, and they've actually given a big commitment to heritage crime, and they've actually called it Operation Apollo. And you can see on the logo there that they took off a gate symbol and put Stonehenge on. So that was a nice touch. We do help people with signs. We don't want to put too many signs out, but where there's a distinct problem, we do. And we provide tactical support grants. So we gave Emily and the team some money for a drone, some thermal imaging cameras, and we do a lot of training. And this is important, and it's always multidisciplinary because that's the real world. Lots of guidance online. And the big change in the policing paradigm has been the introduction of a political element to policing with the Police and Crime Commissioners. And of course, they set the strategic priorities for their force area, and they hold their Chief Constable to account for performance. This is Matthew Scott, the Commissioner for Kent, and he's been very supportive of Heritage Watch in Kent. The key here is if the Commissioner puts the historic environment into their police plan, the Chief Constable has to develop a tactical response. And in terms of legislation, we've been able to work with the Sentencing Council to shape the guidance for theft and handling stolen goods and criminal damage and arson. And if you are convicted of theft or handling a stolen heritage asset or damaging a stolen heritage asset, you are liable to an uplift in your sentence. In terms of something that we call citizens in policing, we now have a growing cohort of police support volunteers. They help with fines identification, search warrants and training. And a big project for us is police cadets. So young people between the ages of 13 and 18, and in some areas even younger than that. And I'm very pleased to say that we've funded the Heritage Crime module, which is now being rolled out across the country. Hopefully we'll be able to outreach to about 17,000 young people to make them heritage aware. So coming up to the end now, let's have a look at some cases at court. So you can see that the judge in this case is actually identifying that it's a heritage asset. Before the sentencing guideline for the theft of metal from a church, we could probably expect between 18 months and 2 years in jail. And when they saw this at 7.5 years. And for illicit metal detecting on a field in Herefordshire, these men received a total of 24.5 years in jail. Who would have thought that when we started? And we're now aligned to the natural environment. So we now sit within the wildlife crime strategy and the rural affairs strategy. We have an growing academic partnership. And the big one for us here at Kent is what started off as a very small lunchtime group, the Heritage and Wildlife Crime Innovation Hub, Hawkeye. We now have 5 partnership universities and commercial partners. And the ethos here is to identify threats identify those tactics and techniques that can help us prevent crime or adapt existing techniques, or the exciting one is invent new tactics and techniques, secure funding and implement. And some of our students have made the transition from academic work into the world of employment. Here's Tim Carter showcasing his work. And Kyle and Abby, both employed now. Tell people what you're doing. So as Sophie will tell you, I do use Twitter quite a bit. And in terms of community outreach and well-being, it's really important. People are passionate about their past. They want to get involved. They want to help. And as Sophie says, I am a community archaeologist here in Whitstable, and I can certainly see the impacts that working in the open air has on people. So next steps, 400,000 asset owners and guardians. How do we get them coordinated and becoming our eyes and ears? Understanding the public's passion for the past and developing quality research and development that will lead to the protection of our sensitive historic environment. That's it.
Thank you, Mark, for your excellent presentation, and also reminding us and emphasizing that heritage crime is not limited to the illicit excavations. Also, we have a few questions about that, but it's much broader than that. It's really damage that is damage to the historic building, damage to the historic fabric, as well as damage and theft of archaeological objects. So we now have a few questions, so it's fantastic. I'm going to ask a few of them. I'm sorry, I just need to get back to that. I think the first one we had, I think, was quite interesting about due to, I think it's more for Mark, the number of collaborations that are required to carry out specialist operations. How do you align your processes in accordance with these organizations? And do you encounter mobilization delays because of this? So basically, how do you coordinate all the different institutions that you mentioned? And I suppose, Carl, as well, that's how do you coordinate all those laboratories that you mentioned during your presentations, and the work of the police, and then the prosecution, etc.?
Yeah. This one has got a defined word, and it's tricky. I speak a variety of languages. Obviously, I speak COP, local authority, a bit of fire service as well. It's trying to understand their own priorities, seeking out people that are an advocate for what you're trying to do, and signing them up. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy, and maintaining those relationships is hard. And I think, Carl, you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I think that my conversations sort of go two ways there, and half of the challenge is the initial communication with an investigating officer to ensure that the lines of inquiry are things that are appropriate to take forward with some scientific analysis, and then the conversation backwards then into the laboratory and with the specialists who might engage with that work to ensure that the work done is proportionate, and that the data that's generated is going to answer the questions. Frequently, there's very little difference the sorts of questions we would ask and seek answers to in terms of major crime, but occasionally there are nuances within heritage crime about the nature of the materials being taken. Can they be demonstrated to be heritage materials that do adapt some of those questions, do force adaptations?
Thank you. And I think also there's a question about why and to what extent this relates to wildlife crime. I suppose, Mark, if you could just briefly answer, because the time is running out, and then I would like to move on to the illicit excavations as well. So could you?
Sure. A lot of the crimes in the historic environment are aligned to the natural environment. So the example I would give you is badgers like living in Bronze Age burial sites. and people dig in to get the badges out, and it's actually a stronger penalty for causing damage to the archaeology than it is to the wildlife. So we're actually being able to give our colleagues in the wildlife sector greater powers. So this is where the joint investigations are really powerful.
Thank you. So we also have a few questions on the archaeological sites. I think they're more for David and Mark. One is about how do you address knowledge loss from the illicit metal detecting where items are not always reported. So I suppose that's a question for England, but you know, the English system, but that also can apply to other countries. David, if you could answer that as an archaeologist, and then Mark, could you say what kind of outreach is being done with metal detectors in England? So David first.
I think there are probably at least two ways of answering this. I mean, one is we know that a number of objects are being removed from archaeological sites or loose in agricultural layers every year that are not being recorded through the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which operates in England and Wales. But the other side of that is actually digging through archaeological layers to remove, say, a coin hoard without archaeological intervention probably means we have a loss of knowledge. And I'm really struck by Eleanor Gay's book on hoards, which the British Museum has just published. And she goes into great detail about the amount of information you can get from a proper excavation of a hoard. You can work out that, you know, the layers of coins, for example, the way the composition was put together. And therefore, I think it's really important that we do stress the loss of knowledge that can never be regained.
Yes, I think that comes back to the word that was used before, context. So we can have the crime context and the archaeological context and all the information that is being lost when the context is being lost. We can learn a little bit from the object, but we never know as much as when it is found and properly excavated. That context is really important.
And sometimes,
Mark, then, sorry.
Well, I was just going to have a rider in that sometimes the information is not accurately recorded, and therefore we're seeing these sort of dots on maps of where finds have been made, but are we sure that those dots represent the actual locations? But Mark probably
yes, and those
are
questions are also those questions are also very important when we talk about the illicit trafficking and you know, transfer of ownership and things like that, when we talk about provenance, which is so important in the art trade. But that's okay. Mark, I think, what about outreach when we talk about metal detectorists and the work that's being done to encourage them to report their finds?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between archaeologists and the detecting community has been, in some cases, a rocky road. But for me, it's been about those people that are operating legally. I see those as a resource. I see them very much as part of the Heritage Watch function. And it allows us to focus on that tiny minority that people know as Nighthawks. I know them as thieves, and we can bear down on them. And I think with the prosecution of those 4 offenders securing those long jail sentences, that really has provided a focus. And yeah, if people break the law, then they are dealt with. If they are complying with the law, and metal detecting in England is legal if they have the landowner's consent and they're not detecting on protected sites, and they are recording anything that is treasure. There is no requirement to report anything unless it is treasure. The Portable Antiquities Scheme is a voluntary scheme, a very good scheme. And our relationship with the detecting community continues to improve.
Thank you. We also have a few questions about the international movement of archaeological objects and also the sharing of best practice. So there's one question about Brexit. To what extent do you expect to become, so in a post-Brexit Europe, do you expect it to become increasingly more difficult to track the illegal trade of heritage material? David, has any of you an answer to that question? I suppose I'm the lawyer, I might have to answer that, but David.
Thank you for that. I suppose living where I do, that I'm seeing countless lorries and coming past, I won't say my house, but in the region. And, you know, I'm well aware of antiquities that are coming into Britain illegally and through our major ports. And I think there was something that was made really quite early on. I think it was by Carl, talking about the sort of forensic archaeology and the sort of range of objects. And I'm minded that some of the red lists show the sort of elite objects, but actually it's the lesser objects that are coming into the country at the moment. So I think we do need to look really carefully in our sort of post-Brexit world about the way we monitor what comes in. I'm not convinced at the moment that Border Force have been given all the skills they need, and I think that's something that we could certainly usefully support them.
And also what is going to be lost is the cooperation, or might be lost, is the quick cooperation between international European police forces now that the UK might be out of the European Union. So because there's Europol, which is facilitate the coordination of European police forces, and that is going to be lost. So it's the facilitation of information across countries. So
yeah, if I can just respond, but I think Mark is probably going to want to say something. I think we've got such really good links with other countries, so scholars and government authorities, that there is that sharing of information. What I don't know is whether that will continue on a more formal basis or on an informal basis.
Mark, you're mute.
Yeah, I'm not ducking out. I concur with David's answer. We're very much in unknown territory here. But what we can do is we can make sure that our end of the business is as secure as we can make it. And I think the training of officers like Andy Long and those officers that work on our borders, maybe developing some technology for them in terms of artifact identification, which you and I have spoken about, would be key to that.
Well, I think also what is of concern to me is, for example, when the government mentions that they want to open free ports, that could be a place where the illicit, that could be a place that would facilitate the trafficking of cultural objects. It has happened in other ports, in Geneva as well, for example. They have cleaned up their act, if we can say so. So I am nothing against free ports, but they have to be managed so that they do not become a place of exchange and a no man's land where everything is permitted. But that could be a worrying sign as well. I think we're going to conclude, so because we're already over, we have quite a few comments and questions. Yeah, Hong Kong is another free port. I think one was quite interesting. Do you think, Mark, that we need a Heritage Crime Act? That's our last question. Do we need more? Do we need more regulation, a new statute? You're mute again.
Of course, I'm going to say yes, aren't I? But I think that we can box clever here. There are currently 2 pieces of heritage legislation going through the House, and I think there is an appetite. And there's a lot of, as I said earlier on, there's a lot of passion and support for this. Whether it's an entire act or whether it's amending some of the bits and pieces we've already got, I'm not sure. But I'd certainly like to see the ability for the Crown Prosecution Service to be able to aggravate certain offences. So, for example, if the church loses its roof, I'd like them to be able to say, this isn't just a metal theft, this is the theft of a heritage asset. and that would allow the courts to deal with it in a different way.
Thank you. So I think we're going to stop now. I've reached the end of our session. We're going to have another one. Our next session will be actually on the protection of underwater heritage, which might also involve some crime because, as Mark mentioned, there was this case decided the last year where two persons.
2017.
Anybody went to the Court of Appeal? Anyway.
Yes, it did. It was dismissed. Yep.
Yeah, so they were fined because they actually looted some underwater heritage and shipwrecks in the channel. So that's going to be the theme of our next webinar, sorry. And please if you do have questions, do not hesitate to send them to me and I will be happy to send them to our presenters. If you want the conversation to keep going, there's no issue, we're going to do that. So thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Carl, for your very interesting presentations. Goodbye.